Snowflakes swirled like tiny white daggers across the lonely mountain road, slashing at headlights that barely cut through the blizzard. The wind carried an eerie hum, a sound both alive and hollow, whispering warnings to anyone foolish enough to be out in such weather. The local sheriff's office had sent out repeated alerts urging everyone to stay home, to bunker down with wood stoves and blankets. But one man had no choice but to face the storm officer Michael Daniels, 28, dedicated to his oath, and too stubborn to let weather or fear keep him from his duty. Daniels' cruiser rumbled up the incline, tires groaning under ice that coated the asphalt. The young officer leaned forward, squinting through the windshield. He knew it was madness, but reports of missing hikers and suspicious activity near the ridge had come in earlier. He had volunteered immediately, telling himself someone had to check it out, even if everyone else thought the storm was too dangerous. Deep down, though, there was more to it. He was tired of being underestimated at the department, tired of senior officers treating him like the rookie, despite 3 years on the force. Tonight was his chance to prove he had grit. Not far from the road, tucked in a clearing where pines leaned heavy under the snow, a small log cabin crouched against the storm. Smoke curled weakly from its chimney, quickly ripped apart by the howling wind. Inside, Walter Harding sat in his worn rocking chair, sharpening a piece of kindling with a small hunting knife. His hands were steady despite the storm rattling his windows. 72 years had weathered his body, but his sharp eyes, gray like the storm outside, still carried the clarity of a man who once saw too much. At his feet lay Rex, his German shepherd, curled tightly but alert, ears twitching with every whistle of the wind. Rex was no ordinary dog. Years ago, he had served with the police K9 unit, trained to sniff out danger and save lives. Retirement had left scars across his body, an old limp, a cloudy eye, but his spirit remained unbroken. To Walter, Rex was more than a companion. He was the last piece of family he had. Walter muttered as he tossed the sharpened stick into the fire. Storm like this'll bury the town whole. Only a fool would wander out there tonight. Rex whined softly, lifting his head, his dark eyes staring at the door. Walter frowned. He had learned long ago never to ignore the dog's instincts. Rex had saved him once years back, when Walter's grief nearly dragged him too deep into despair. The dog had been given to him by chance, adopted after no one else wanted an aging, half-broken canine. Together, they had survived loneliness that might have killed them both. Still, tonight, Walter shook his head. "Ain't nothing out there but wind and trouble," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. The storm pressed harder against the cabin walls, groaning as if it wanted in. Walter rocked slowly, memories slipping through like shadows. He thought of his military days, of cold nights spent crouched in trenches, of men's last words carried away by the wind. He thought of his wife, long gone, taken in an accident that left him scarred in ways no wound ever could. He thought of his daughter, the one person who might have kept him tethered, lost to illness before she had the chance to grow old. Those thoughts always came with the storm. Perhaps that was why he hated snow. Most of all, it reminded him of everything life had stolen. Miles away, Officer Daniels' cruiser hit a patch of ice, fishtailing before he regained control. His knuckles widened on the steering wheel. "Easy, steady," he muttered. The storm was worsening faster than forecasted. Flakes thickened, spinning so violently that it felt like the entire world was dissolving into white. The young officer's radio crackled, but only static answered. He sighed, realizing backup wouldn't come if things went wrong. He thought briefly of his mother, who always called him before big shifts. She had begged him not to work tonight, but Daniels had brushed it off with a laugh. "It's just weather, Mom. Don't worry." Now her words haunted him. As the cruiser climbed higher, Daniels spotted something, a flicker of movement across the ridge, like shadows darting between trees. He slowed, leaning forward, eyes narrowing. His heart thudded. In storms like this, eyes played tricks. Still, instincts told him something was there. Inside the cabin, Rex suddenly leapt to his feet, growling low. His fur bristled, and he pressed his nose against the door, tail stiff like a soldier on guard. Walter set down his knife, eyes narrowing. He knew that growl. It wasn't hunger or restlessness. It was warning. "What is it, boy?" Walter asked, rising stiffly. The dog barked once, sharp, as if to say, "Danger's near." Walter grabbed his heavy coat and peered through the frosted window. Nothing but white swirls and black pines. Still, the unease settled in his gut. He trusted Rex more than his own eyes. Back on the road, Daniels slowed his cruiser to a crawl. His headlights flashed across a bend, illuminating a narrow pass where the snow seemed deeper. His pulse quickened when he saw tire tracks veering off into the woods. He parked, stepping out into knee-deep snow, the wind slamming into him like fists. Pulling his flashlight, he followed the tracks a few steps, but the storm was already swallowing them. "Hello?" he shouted into the night. Only the storm answered, shrieking like 1,000 voices. He turned back toward the cruiser, unease tightening his stomach. For the first time, he wondered if he had made a mistake coming alone. In the cabin, Rex barked again, more urgent this time. Walter finally gave in, crouching to meet the dog's eyes. All right. You're telling me someone's out there." He sighed, rubbing his face. But who in their right mind would be out in this hell? The old man stood at the window again, hand resting on the frame, heart beating with the old familiar rhythm of tension. Something was stirring beyond those trees. He didn't know it yet, but fate was pushing two strangers, one old and weary, one young and untested, onto the same path. And outside, the storm grew worse, burying everything in silence, except for the faint echo of footsteps lost in the snow. The storm clawed harder at the mountainside, as if it wanted to strip the world bare. Officer Michael Daniels pressed forward, trudging back toward his cruiser after spotting those strange tracks. His boots sank into the snow with a crunch that was swallowed instantly by the shrieking wind. His flashlight beam chittered across the dark forest line, catching glimpses of twisting branches and ice-laden trunks. The storm made everything look alive, like ghostly shapes moving just beyond reach. Daniel shook his head, muttering, "Get it together." He was alone, tired, and deep into a storm that could kill a man in less than an hour if he wasn't careful. Still, unease gnawed at him. Years of training told him his instincts weren't wrong. Something was out here. When he reached the cruiser, his hand froze on the driver's door. The hair at the back of his neck bristled. The headlights dimly illuminated the snow ahead, and in that faint glow, he caught movement against shadows, crossing the road too smoothly to be branches swaying. He drew his sidearm, his breath clouding in the frigid air. "Sheriff's Department." He shouted over the storm. "Show yourself." Nothing. The wind roared, carrying his voice away like it never existed. Daniels tightened his grip on the weapon. That was when it happened. Figures erupted from the darkness, storm masks covering their faces, heavy coats blending with the night. One slammed into him from behind, sending him sprawling into the snow. His gun flew from his hands, disappearing into the drift. Another man kicked it further away, laughing. Daniels tried to push up, but a boot pressed into his back, shoving him down. Hands yanked his arms roughly behind him, binding them with a coarse rope that bit into his skin. "Got the cop," one voice growled, muffled by the mask but unmistakably cruel. Daniels struggled, his chest heaving. "Who the hell are you?" He spat, snow filling his mouth. The men didn't answer. One crouched, yanking Daniels upright so their eyes met. Though covered, the man's gaze was sharp, calculated. Not drunk, not random, this was planned. "You should have stayed in town," the man said simply, then slammed his fist into Daniel's stomach. The officer doubled over, coughing violently. Another man leaned close, whispering cold words against his ear. "Nobody's going to find you out here. Not in this storm." Fear clawed at Daniel's chest, but so did rage. He had expected a quiet patrol, maybe a stranded motorist at worst. Not this. He tried kicking, but the men were stronger, outnumbering him 3-1. They dragged him across the snow like a sack of grain, his boots scraping ice, his lungs burning from the cold. At the edge of the road, they shoved him against a snowbank, pushing him half under its icy weight. The cold gripped him instantly, slicing into his bones. One of the men tightened the rope around his wrists, pulling until his skin split. Daniels clenched his jaw, refusing to show weakness. "Cowards," he hissed. "You think this will stop me?" The leader chuckled, crouching again. "Stop you? No? Bury you?" "Yes." His gloved hand pressed against Daniel's chest, forcing him deeper into the snow. "You've been sniffing where you shouldn't, officer. This is what happens." Daniel's eyes widened. So this wasn't random. They knew him. They knew why he was here. He tried to form words, to demand answers, but his body was failing. The freezing air stabbed at his lungs with every shallow breath. The men rose, their silhouettes dissolving into the storm as quickly as they had appeared. One glanced back, let the snow finish it, and then they were gone. Daniels lay there, bound and gasping, the snow already creeping over him like a shroud. He writhed, trying to free himself, but the rope held fast. His muscles screamed. The cold made every movement slower, weaker. The wind shrieked above him, drowning his attempts to cry out. He tried anyway, his voice hoarse. "Help! Somebody!" His throat cracked, the storm devouring the sound whole. The minutes dragged. Each second stole more warmth from his body. His lips turned blue, his fingers numb. He thought of his mother again, her voice pleading on the phone. He thought of the department, the men who had doubted him, who might never know what had happened to him. And he thought of the town below, its people unaware that corruption had already climbed into their mountains. Daniel's vision blurred. He forced himself to stay awake, to keep fighting. He couldn't let it end here, nameless in a snowbank. He pressed his cheek against the icy ground, tears freezing instantly. Above him, the storm roared on, merciless. Miles away, Walter Harding tossed another log into his fire. The storm rattled the cabin harder now, its voice growing more feral. He reached for his tea, but his hand paused halfway. Rex had risen again, his body rigid, ears pricked to the night. "What now?" Walter muttered. The dog growled deep in his throat, pacing before the door. Walter frowned, feeling the old familiar pull of adrenaline he hadn't felt since combat. It was absurd to think anyone was out there, but Rex had never been wrong before. "Someone's out there," Walter whispered, more to himself than the dog. His stomach tightened. He didn't know who. He didn't know why. But he felt danger had come with the storm. And somewhere in the swirling white, Officer Daniels lay fighting for his life, praying for a miracle that only fate or a stubborn old man and his loyal dog could deliver. The wind slammed against the cabin walls like fists, rattling shutters and shaking the old timber frame. Walter Harding sat stiff in his chair, eyes locked on the door where Rex was stationed. The dog's fur bristled, his body tense as a drawn bowstring. His growl wasn't playful or restless. It was the low, guttural warning of a predator sensing danger. Walter set down his mug. "All right, boy," he muttered, voice gravelly with age. "You don't get riled up for nothing. What are you hearing out there?" Rex's nose pressed against the crack at the bottom of the door, inhaling sharply, whining. His body shifted side to side with urgency, like he was trying to drag Walter into the storm by sheer will. Walter sighed heavily, dragging a hand down his weathered face. At 72, storms weren't challenges anymore. They were survival threats. His joints ached in the cold. His lungs didn't have the strength they once did. For most men his age, staying inside was wisdom. But Walter had never lived by wisdom alone. He lived by instinct, and tonight instinct said his dog wasn't wrong. "You think there's someone out there?" Walter said softly, almost to himself. The dog barked once, sharp and clear. Walter rose from his chair, the joints in his knees cracking like old wood. He moved to the window, squinting into the storm. Snowflakes smeared across the glass, blinding his view, but every so often the wind parted just enough to show the dark outline of trees bowing under their icy weight. Nothing else. No movement. No light. Just a world swallowed by white chaos. Still his gut churned. He turned back, staring at the shelves on his cabin wall. Each item there was a piece of his past. A faded photo of his wife, her smile forever young. A military medal in a cracked wooden frame, gathering dust. His daughter's toy horse, carved from oak, the last thing she'd held before sickness took her away. These were the ghosts he lived with, the reason he kept himself apart from the world. Yet here was Rex, dragging him back into it with nothing more than a growl and a stare. "You're gonna get me killed one of these days," Walter muttered, but he was already reaching for his coat. The heavy wool weighed on his shoulders as he slid it on. Then he pulled his boots tight around his calves. He lifted his old hunting rifle from above the mantel, checked the chamber out of habit, then slung it over his back. His cane leaned against the wall by the door, more tool than necessity. He hated using it, but in snow this deep, even pride had limits. Rex spun in circles, barking eagerly as Walter unlatched the door. The storm howled into the cabin the moment it cracked open, icy wind stabbing like knives against Walter's exposed face. He squinted, pulled his scarf tighter, and stepped out into the night. The snow was merciless. Within seconds, it clung to his coat, bit at his skin, and weighed heavy on his boots. Walter leaned on his cane, each step sinking deep. The storm roared in his ears, stealing away the sound of his breath. If not for Rex leading, he might have turned back. But the dog's movements were sharp, determined. He wasn't wandering. He was following something. Walter trudged after him, his mind drifting despite the cold. He remembered other storms, long ago Korea, then Vietnam nights when snow or rain felt like enemies themselves. He remembered dragging wounded men through mud, bullets cracking overhead, whispering promises he couldn't keep. He had sworn then that he'd never let another man die alone if he could help it. That oath, buried under years of loss and grief, clawed its way back tonight. "Lord help me," Walter whispered. "There better be someone out here, or I've finally gone mad." They pushed deeper into the woods, branches whipping against Walter's coat. Rex sniffed constantly, nose close to the ground, then lifting to taste the wind. His bark cut through the storm every few minutes, sharp and confident, guiding Walter like a beacon. The old man's body screamed at him. His legs ached, his lungs burned. He paused once, leaning heavy on his cane, chest heaving. Snow piled on his shoulders, clung to his beard, froze in his brows. He wanted to turn back, to tell himself this was foolishness. But then Rex whined, staring up at him with eyes so insistent, so alive with purpose, that Walter forced himself forward. Somewhere ahead, faintly, he thought he heard something. Not the wind, not branches. A muffled cry, weak, distant, but human. Walter froze, heart hammering. He wasn't sure if he'd imagined it. "Rex, you hear that?" The dog barked wildly, lunging forward. Walter's breath caught. His instincts had been right. Someone was out here, and they were in trouble. He pressed harder, following Rex as the dog clawed through drifts nearly up to his chest. The cry came again, clearer this time, strangled by the storm, but unmistakable. A man's voice, hoarse, desperate. "Help!" Walter's gut tightened. That voice wasn't a trick of the storm, it was real. "Hold on!" Walter shouted into the blizzard, his own voice barely carrying. "We're coming!" The dog barked furiously, pulling Walter toward a mound of snow near the tree line. At first glance, it looked like nothing but drift. But then Walter saw movement, a twitch, a faint shift of color. His heart pounded. They had found him. The snowdrift looked lifeless at first, a mound sculpted by the storm. But then it shifted, and a muffled groan bled through the wind. Walter's chest clenched. Someone was buried alive beneath. "Rex, dig!" Walter barked. The dog lunged forward without hesitation, paws tearing at the snow. His claws carved furrows as he whined, driven by instinct. Walter dropped to his knees, his cane falling uselessly into the drift, and began clawing with his bare hands. The icy powder burned like fire against his skin, but adrenaline pushed the pain aside. At last, a face emerged, pale, lips tinged blue, eyes half-lidded. Officer Michael Daniels was barely conscious, snow crusting his eyelashes, ropes cutting into his wrists. His body was stiff, shivering violently one moment, then still the next. Walter knew the signs. Hypothermia was already setting in. "Don't you quit on me, son?" Walter growled, ripping at the knots binding Daniel's arms. His hands trembled, not from age, but from urgency. The rope was tight, frozen hard as stone, but Walter's knife was sharper. With one firm slash, the bond snapped. Daniels sagged limply into Walter's arms, gasping weakly. His voice cracked into the storm, barely audible. "Help, please." Walter's jaw clenched. "You're not dying on my watch." He tore off his own coat and wrapped it around the younger man, pulling it tight. Then he pressed Daniels against Rex's flank. The dog curled instinctively, his warm body shielding the officer. The shepherd whined softly, nudging Daniel's face with his nose as though urging him to hold on. Walter knew they couldn't stay here. Every minute in the snow was a death sentence. The cabin wasn't far, maybe half a mile, but in this weather, it might as well be 100. Still, it was the only chance. "Come on," Walter muttered, bracing himself. With a grunt, he hoisted Daniels under the arms, dragging his limp body upward. Snow clung to them, pulling them down, but Walter's strength honed decades ago in war and still hiding in his bones pushed back. Each step was a battle. The storm screamed louder, wind slashing sideways with blinding force. Walter leaned heavily into it, teeth gritted, eyes watering. His boots sank deep into drifts, and every time he pulled one free, it felt like his legs were tearing apart. Daniel's weight dragged at him, but Walter never faltered. He muttered under his breath, not prayers exactly, but commands to himself. One more step. Don't quit. Just one more. Rex darted ahead, then circled back, barking encouragement. The dog's fur was frosted, his tail stiff with cold, but he pressed forward with unwavering determination. Walter followed his lead, trusting him to cut through the storm better than any compass could. Behind him, Daniels stirred weakly, mumbling. His words were slurred, barely coherent. Too cold. Can't. Walter barked over the wind. Don't you say that. You hear me? You're not quitting. Breathe, damn it. Just keep breathing. The officer's head lolled against Walter's shoulder, his eyes fluttering shut. Walter's heart pounded. He'd seen this before, men freezing, slipping into that deceptive calm before death. He shook Daniels roughly, forcing his eyes open. Stay with me? Look at me, son. Look at me. Daniels blinked, dazed, but focused for a moment. Walter didn't let him drift again. They pressed on. Time blurred into a haze of white and pain. Walter's muscles burned, his lungs screamed, but something deeper kept him moving, the oath he had carried since the battlefield. Never let a man die alone if you can help it. At last, through the swirling snow, Walter glimpsed a faint orange glow. His cabin. The sight was salvation. There, he croaked, voice raw. Almost home, Rex barked, sprinting ahead to the door, pawing furiously as if begging the cabin to open itself. Walter stumbled the last few steps, dragging Daniel's weight with a final surge of strength. They crashed through the door in a blast of icy wind. Walter shoved it shut with his back, panting hard. Inside, the fire still burned low, its glow flickering weakly against the log walls. Warmth kissed his face, though it barely dented the frost that coated his beard. Walter eased Daniels down onto a rug near the fire. The young man's skin was ghostly, his breath shallow. Walter dropped to his knees beside him, hands moving with the precision of memory. He stripped away Daniel's soaked uniform, tossing it aside, and replaced it with blankets pulled from a nearby trunk. "Stay with me, son?" Walter muttered, rubbing the officer's arms vigorously, forcing blood to flow. He poured steaming water into a mug, holding it carefully to Daniel's lips. "Drink. Slow now." "That's it." Daniels coughed, sputtered, but managed to swallow. His chest rose deeper this time, though still shaky. Rex curled tightly against him, his body a furnace of loyalty and warmth. The dog's eyes never left the officer's face, as if willing him to survive. Walter sat back, wiping sweat and melted snow from his brow. Relief washed through him, tempered by grim reality. This man wasn't safe yet. It would take hours to stabilize him, maybe days to recover. But at least he wasn't alone in the snow anymore. The old man studied the officer's face. Young, far too young. Strong jaw, but softened by inexperience. The kind of face Walter had seen on countless boys sent to war. Boys who carried the weight of the world, but didn't yet understand its cruelty. "You've still got years ahead of you," Walter whispered. "Not tonight. Not like this." Daniel stirred, his voice a whisper. "Why? Why do you help me?" Walter glanced at Rex, then back at the officer. His answer was simple, though his voice was heavy with memory. "Because someone had to. And because he gestured toward Rex, wouldn't let me stay behind." A fire crackled, filling the silence. Outside, the storm howled on, determined to bury the world. But inside that cabin, 3 lives clung to warmth and hope, bound not by blood or fate, but by instinct, loyalty, and the stubborn refusal of an old soldier who still had one more fight left in him. The storm showed no mercy. Morning came, but the howling wind smothered any hint of daylight. Snow piled against the cabin walls so thickly that the windows glowed only with a dim bluish haze. It felt as though the world had been buried alive. Inside, the fire was kept alive through Walter's stubborn discipline. He rose often to stoke it, feeding it with logs he had chopped weeks before. Each time he glanced at the young officer sleeping near the hearth, his jaw clenched with a strange mixture of relief and unease. Michael Daniels had survived the night. His breathing was steadier now, his skin no longer corpse pale. But sleep was restless. His lips murmured fragments of words, half-formed cries, the sounds of a man haunted even in unconsciousness. Walter knew the look. He had worn it himself for decades. Rex, the dog, lay like a sentinel between them, ears twitching at every groan, tail thumping softly whenever Daniel stirred. The shepherd seemed to sense the fragility of this boy's life, guarding him as though it were his own. When Daniels finally woke, he squinted into the firelight, disoriented. His throat rasped when he spoke. "Still alive," Walter grunted. "Barely. You'll need more than blankets and broth before you can call yourself steady." Daniels propped himself weakly on one elbow, eyeing the cabin. His gaze landed again on the shelf above the fireplace, the line of old photographs. Something about them tugged at his attention. "You said you were military," he murmured, his voice quiet but insistent. Walter didn't look up from the kettle he was filling. "I said once. Long time ago." Daniel studied one particular picture. Walter, decades younger, standing in uniform with a dozen other soldiers. He leaned closer, squinting. This was Korea, wasn't it? My grandfather used to show me photos like this." The old man's hand froze mid-motion. Slowly, he turned, eyes narrowing. "Your grandfather?" Daniels nodded faintly. "Yeah, he was Army too. Sergeant Harold Daniels. He barely ever talked about it, but sometimes, after a drink or two, he'd mention the chosen reservoir. Said it was hell frozen over." Walter's chest tightened. He hadn't heard that name aloud in years. Memories came rushing back, gunfire echoing in the mountains, frozen rivers choked with bodies, men screaming for medics who never came. The kind of horror that aged a boy into an old man overnight. Walter set the kettle down with shaking hands. "I was there." Daniels blinked. "You fought at Chosen?" Walter gave a slow nod. "Company B, 31st Infantry. We were cut off for weeks. Freezing, starving, surrounded." "Your grandfather?" "He was with us." A stunned silence fell. Daniel's eyes widened, the weight of connection sinking in. You knew him?" Walter looked into the fire, his face carved with shadow. "I did more than know him." Daniel's breath caught. "What do you mean?" Walter didn't answer at first. His mind wandered back through decades to the moment he wished he could erase, the night they had tried to break out under artillery fire and blinding snow. Harold Daniels had been there, covering the retreat. And Walter? Walter had been the one who left him behind. The old man swallowed hard, his voice low, almost breaking. "Your grandfather saved my life, but I wasn't able to save his." Daniel's heart stuttered. He pushed himself up further, ignoring the weakness in his limbs. "What are you saying?" Walter finally met his gaze. His eyes were red-rimmed, glistening with unshed tears. "He died because of me." The words landed like a hammer blow. The cabin suddenly felt smaller, the air heavier. Daniel stared, struggling to comprehend. "You left him?" Walter's fists clenched on his knees. "We were ambushed. The snow was coming down, so thick we couldn't see our own boots. Men were dropping every second. Harold covered us while we carried out the wounded. I told him I'd come back for him, but when I turned around, the Chinese were already there. I didn't go back." Daniel's chest rose and fell rapidly. Anger sparked through his exhaustion. "All these years. You carried that? And now I find out here, in the middle of a storm, after you dragged me out of the snow?" Walter's voice cracked. "I swore I'd never leave another man behind again. That's why I couldn't walk away from you." "Not this time." Daniels stared at him, torn between fury and gratitude, grief and confusion. The betrayal his grandfather must have felt, dying alone in the ice, clashed violently with the fact that this same man had just saved his own life. The fire popped, the sound sharp in the silence. Finally, Daniel spoke. his voice shaking. My father hated him, you know. Said he came back from Korea, broken, cold, angry at the world. He never explained why. Now I wonder if he felt abandoned, if he knew the ones he trusted most couldn't save him. Walter's face crumpled. His hands trembled as he covered his eyes, shoulders heaving with the weight of guilt. I've thought of him every day. I see his face every time I close my eyes. Rex whined, pressing against Walter's leg as if sensing his master's torment. Daniels wanted to scream at him, to rage at the injustice, but the exhaustion in Walter's eyes held him back. This wasn't a man who had forgotten or excused himself. This was a man who had been punishing himself for 70 years. Silence stretched between them, filled only by the storm's endless wail. At last, Daniels exhaled shakily. So that's why you saved me. To make it right. Walter's voice was rough. There's no making it right. But maybe there's keeping a promise. To him. To myself. Daniels leaned back, staring into the fire. He wanted to hate the old man. Part of him did. Yet another part, the part warmed by the blankets, by the dog curled at his side, by the fire Walter kept stoking, knew he owed his survival to him. His throat tightened. My grandfather died out there. But so did a part of you, didn't it? Walter didn't answer. His silence was answer enough. The storm outside screamed louder, rattling the cabin walls. Inside, two men sat bound together by threads of past and present, threads woven from betrayal, guilt, survival, and the cruel honesty of war. Neither spoke again for a long while. The truth had emerged, and it hung between them like the storm itself, relentless, unescapable, and cold enough to break the heart. By the third day, the storm relented. The howling wind softened to a mournful whistle through the pines, and a pale light seeped through the cabin's frost-streaked windows. Outside, the world was buried under mountains of white, a landscape both beautiful and deadly. The silence felt heavy, like the earth itself was holding its breath. Inside, warmth lingered from the fire that Walter had tended faithfully, but the air between the two men remained cold, charged with the unspoken. Michael Daniels sat propped against a chair, his body still weak, but stronger than before. Color had returned to his cheeks, and his breathing no longer rasped with each inhale. Yet his eyes held a storm of their own anger, grief, and confusion swirling all at once. Walter busied himself with small tasks, sharpening his knife, mending a torn strap, feeding wrecked scraps from an old tin. But his movements were stiff, his face pale with the weight of confession. Every silence seemed to press down harder, as though the cabin walls were closing in. Finally, Daniels broke it. You carried that secret all these years. His voice was low, steady, but there was an edge beneath it. Walter didn't look up. Some secrets don't stay buried. They rot, eat you from the inside out. Daniel's jaw clenched. And now you've dumped it on me. Walter's hand stilled on the strap he was stitching. His eyes rose slowly, tired but unflinching. It wasn't dumping, son. You deserve the truth. The younger man's voice sharpened. The truth? That you left my grandfather to die? That the man I grew up respecting, hearing stories about, spent his last moments abandoned in the snow while you lived? Walter's throat tightened, but he forced the words out. Yes, that truth. The fire crackled, filling the silence that followed. Daniels turned his face away, jaw tight, struggling to control the flood of emotion. For years, his family had lived with unanswered questions. Why Harold Daniels never came home. Why the war had stolen more than his life. His father had grown bitter, his grandmother silent. And now, the answer lay before him. This old soldier, gaunt and weary, carrying guilt like a second skin. Daniels spoke again, voice raw. Why didn't you go back? Why didn't you try? Walter's eyes burned. I did try. God help me, I tried. But by the time I turned, they were on him. The snow was so thick, I couldn't even see 10 feet ahead. We were being overrun, men screaming all around me. I froze. I was 21 years old, scared out of my damn mind. And I froze. His voice cracked, and he pressed his fist to his chest as though trying to steady the pounding there. I've been frozen ever since. Daniel swallowed hard, his anger battling with the sight of the man before him, not a monster, not a coward, but someone who had been broken long ago and never mended. You don't understand, Walter continued, his voice trembling. Your grandfather. He was braver than all of us. He knew he wasn't getting out. He told me to run, told me to save who I could. I obeyed, and I've hated myself for it every day since. The younger man shut his eyes, a tear slipping free despite his efforts. He wanted to cling to anger, but grief was stronger. Rex stirred from where he lay, padding over to nuzzle against Daniel's hand. The officer stroked the dog's head absently, grounding himself in the warmth of the loyal creature. So this, Daniels whispered, saving me, this was your penance. Walter nodded, shoulders slumped. I couldn't save Harold, but I could save you. Maybe that's the only redemption I'll ever find. The words cut deep. Daniels stared at the fire, seeing not the flames, but the image of a young soldier, his grandfather, standing tall against impossible odds. And beside him, a terrified boy who would carry that moment for the rest of his life. You want forgiveness? Daniels asked finally, his tone sharp. Walter flinched, but didn't shy away. I don't deserve it. The younger man's hands trembled, clutching the blanket tighter. He didn't know what he felt: betrayal for his grandfather, gratitude for his own survival, pity for the broken old man across from him. You're right, Daniels said quietly. You don't deserve it. Not for what happened then. Walter's face fell, but he didn't argue. He only lowered his head, accepting the judgment he had feared all along. But Daniels wasn't finished. His voice softened, though it still carried weight. But for what you did now, for dragging me out of that storm, for risking your life, you deserve something. Maybe not forgiveness, but thanks. Walter lifted his gaze slowly, surprise flickering in his weary eyes. Daniels continued, his voice steadying. If you hadn't come, I'd be dead. I don't know if I can ever forgive you for the past, but I can't ignore the present either. You saved me. And maybe that means something. The old man's eyes shone, the faintest glimmer of relief breaking through decades of torment. He gave a slow nod. It means more than you know. The two men sat in silence, not reconciled, but no longer enemies. Somewhere between them, in the space held by firelight and Rex's quiet breathing, a fragile understanding took root. Outside, the storm had broken. The sky was clearing, revealing a pale, bruised dawn. The world lay blanketed in snow, but beneath it, life waited, stubborn and persistent. Daniels shifted weakly, looking toward the window. Storm's over. Walter followed his gaze, then muttered, Storms don't end. They just change shape. Rex barked softly, as though in agreement. Daniels managed the faintest smile. Maybe, but we survived this one. Walter leaned back, exhaustion etched into every line of his face. Survival's the easy part. Living with it, that's the fight. The words lingered, heavy but true. As the morning light crept into the cabin, two men and a dog sat together, each scarred by the past, bound by the present, and uncertain of the future. The weight of forgiveness still hung in the air, unresolved. But for the first time, Walter felt that maybe, just maybe, he had taken one step toward peace. The storm had passed. The mountains lay silent, white and pristine, under the first light of dawn. Trees bowed under the weight of snow, glistening in a fragile morning glow. The world seemed untouched, as though the blizzard had never raged. But inside Walter Harding's cabin, silence carried a deeper weight. Michael Daniels sat near the fire, still weak, wrapped in the blankets Walter had provided. His eyes wandered over the room, lingering on the photographs, the tools, and the careful order that had marked the cabin as a place of purpose. Yet the weight of what he had learned, the connection between Walter and his grandfather, settled heavily on his chest. Rex lay sprawled beside him, finally relaxed, his ears twitching at the faint sounds of birds returning. The dog's presence was steady, grounding. Walter moved quietly, putting another log on the fire. His face was pale, eyes lined with exhaustion, yet there was a quiet strength there, born of survival and decades of burden carried alone. "Ready to leave?" Walter asked softly. Daniels shook his head. "Not yet. I need to process. I need to understand," Walter nodded. "Take all the time you need. There's no rush. The snow isn't going anywhere." The younger man turned toward him, voice hesitant. "Why did you tell me the truth?" "You didn't have to." Walter paused, fingers resting on the log he had just placed in the fire. "Because the truth has a way of catching up to you. It doesn't matter if you hide it for years. Sooner or later, someone's going to see. And if I didn't tell you, I couldn't carry another life on my conscience. Not yours. Not anyone else's." Daniels absorbed the words, realizing the depth of the old man's torment. He was no longer just the soldier who had failed his grandfather. He was also the man who had risked everything to save him from death in the storm. Two realities clashed violently, leaving Daniels unsure how to feel. "You could have left me in the snow," Daniels said finally, his voice low. "You didn't have to risk yourself." Walter's eyes softened. "And I didn't. But I couldn't. Not again. I swore that after Harold, I'd never leave another man behind. That promise kept me alive tonight. And it'll keep me alive for as long as I can still move." The words hung in the cabin, heavy with truth. Daniels swallowed, trying to untangle gratitude from anger, survival from sorrow. He reached toward Rex, running a hand along the dog's back. The warmth of the animal was the only comfort that didn't carry weight or judgment. Hours passed, and the storm's remnants began to melt, sunlight filtering through the high windows and reflecting off the snow outside. The mountainside sparkled, beautiful and lethal at once. Daniels rose carefully, moving to the window. He traced his fingers along the frost on the glass, eyes fixed on the distant valley below. For the first time, he allowed himself to feel the enormity of what had happened. The storm, the ambush, the rescue, and the revelations of the past. "You were with him," Daniels said quietly, more to himself than Walter. "You left him. And I can see now why the family never spoke of it." Walter stood beside him, silent. He knew there was no excuse, only truth and its consequences. "I never stopped remembering. Every day I relived it. Every night I heard his voice telling me I failed. That guilt, it never left. Not for a single moment." Daniels swallowed, staring out at the frozen valley. "And yet here you are, alive, and I'm alive. Somehow, maybe that's the only redemption you get. That you survived long enough to do this right." Walter gave a faint nod, but the shadows in his eyes did not fade. "Redemption doesn't erase the past, son. It just lets you keep moving forward." Silence followed, filled with the sound of dripping water from melting snow and the distant call of returning birds. The cabin felt suspended in time, a small haven between the horrors of history and the fragility of now. Daniels turned back to the fire, his hands wrapped around the mug of steaming water Walter had poured earlier. "I still can't forgive you," he admitted. "Not yet. Maybe never completely. But I can't hate you either. You saved me. And maybe that has to be enough. Walter's lips quivered, a rare vulnerability showing through the hardened exterior. That's all I can ask for. The old man sank into his chair, weary from the storm and the weight of his own past. For decades, he had carried guilt heavier than any log he had lifted, heavier than any rifle he had fired. Now, for the first time, he allowed himself to feel the faintest relief that maybe his burden could be shared, even if forgiveness remained elusive. Rex padded over to curl at Walter's feet, his head resting lightly against his master's ankle. A dog's steady breathing filled the cabin with a small, enduring warmth. Outside, the sun climbed higher, and the snow began to glimmer like a field of diamonds. The storm had taken much, but it had also left something behind: survival, clarity, and a chance to reconcile with the past, however incomplete that reconciliation might be. Daniels finally spoke, voice quiet but firm. "I'll never forget this night. Not the storm. Not you. Not Rex. And not the truth." Walter nodded slowly, letting the silence answer the rest. There were no more apologies to be made, no more confessions left. The past had been laid bare. All that remained was the fragile present. He glanced at the young officer one last time. "You've got a life ahead of you. Don't waste it on anger or guilt or fear. Learn from what's behind and keep moving. That's all anyone can do." Daniels met his gaze, eyes glinting with understanding and sorrow. "I'll try. I promise." The cabin held its quiet, the fire's warmth wrapping around them like a shield. Outside, the storm had become memory, the mountains serene once more. Inside, 2 men and a dog had survived both the storm of nature and the storm of their own lives. And though the truth had been heartbreaking, though forgiveness remained uncertain, they had endured. They had survived. Walter leaned back, letting a deep, weary breath escape him. For decades, he had carried the weight of failure. Tonight, he allowed himself a small measure of hope that perhaps, at last, he could carry it with someone else. Rex lifted his head, ears pricked toward the window, tail wagging faintly. The dog had sensed the storm's end before any human could. Daniels whispered softly, a note of gratitude carried in the quiet cabin. "Thank you. For everything." Walter didn't answer, only offered the faintest nod, eyes returning to the dancing firelight. No words could encapsulate the night's horrors, the decades of guilt, or the tenuous hope for redemption. Outside, the sun shone on the snow, indifferent to human suffering and triumph alike. But inside the cabin, life endured, fragile and bright against the darkness of the past. And in that small sanctuary, 3 survivors, an old man, a young officer, and a loyal dog remained, bound forever by a storm, a rescue, and a truth too painful to ignore, yet too vital to forget.